In this video, we're going to be learning about Class 11, Legal Studies, Chapter 1, Concept of State. Before we dive right into the contents of this chapter, let's just understand the basics. What is legal studies? This is a brand new subject which we've never studied in 10th, 9th, ever before. And before starting a new chapter of a new subject, let's understand what the subject means. What are we going to learn in this subject? Well, to understand that, let's understand what the word legal studies means itself. We know what studies means. What does legal mean? Legal is anything related to law. What is law, you may ask? Law is a system of rules enforced by governmental institutions or a supreme power. So when these governmental institutions, such as the legislature or the executive, or a supreme power, like the monarch king, if they enforce some rules, it's called a law. And anything related to law or anything related to these governmental institutions that enforce these laws, it's called something that is legal binding. And in this subject, that's what we're going to learn about. We're going to learn about all these legal institutions, these governmental institutions, these system of rules, etc. Now, in your textbook, we have this picture, and this picture is actually the Supreme Court of India. The reason why I'm emphasizing on the textbook as a whole is because this entire subject is based on this one textbook. For class 12, the entire subject, the entire syllabus is based on the textbook alone. So if we study the textbook as efficiently and as effectively as possible, that's all we need to score good marks in this subject. This entire subject is only textbook based. In this video, I'm going to make the textbook as simple and easy to understand as possible. What are we going to learn? Well, we're going to learn about the first chapter in the first unit, political institutions, and it's called Concept of State. Now, before we get into the chapter, let us understand this unit, political institutions. What are political institutions? Well, same thing we did to understand the definition of legal studies. Let's break apart the word into political and institutions. Political is anything related to government and public affairs. We know what political means. We have studied political science in the past. And the word political is anything related to government, public affairs, politics, etc. Institutions. This is a important keyword. An institution is any organization or foundation which establishes norms or establishes rules. And these norms may be political norms, social norms, etc. An example of a political institution is a state or the government, which is actually a part of the state, the organs of the government. So in this chapter, the first chapter of this unit, we're going to learn about the concept of a state, which is a political institution. What is a state? So as you can see, we have a map of Andhra Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh. And we may believe that these are states. Yes, they're states of India. But from an international standpoint, I repeat, international standpoint, these are not states. In India, we call these as states, but the world doesn't recognize these as states. The world recognizes India as a state. And every country is a state. This might sound misleading, but we have been always assuming that states are subnational entities, but that's not true. A state is anything that has 4 elements. So as you can see these terms on the screen, these are confusing terminology that we often use interchangeably. We often use state, country, nation, nation state, but I want to clarify this and I want to tell you guys what each of these terms mean and how they're actually not the same. However, state and country are the same from an international standpoint. State and country is any entity which has 4 elements. territory, population, sovereignty, and government, right? What about a nation? We often think that nation and country are the same, but no. State and country are tangible. They're actual things. They're actual territories which have a population, and the people itself, they have supreme power and authority over their territory, and that's being governed by an institution like the government. Where the nation is different. It's an idea, it's a feeling of collective and common identity among people. If they share the same history, share the same culture, etc. It's abstract. So we can say that all nations are states, but not all states are nations. Now let's get into these two terms, state nation and nation state, right? What is a state nation? It's where the state and nation boundaries do not align. Or basically, the state has its own boundaries, right? That's fixed. But the nation, since nation is an idea, its boundaries aren't necessarily fixed, right? I can live in America and I can say that I'm an Indian because that's just my feeling, right? The feeling of a nation isn't just constricted within the boundary in the case of a state nation. Or, in other words, a state nation allows multiple diversities. India is an example of a state nation. For example, one can claim himself as an Indian, he can claim himself as a Tamilian, he can claim himself as a Dalit, etc. One person, multiple identities, multiple diversities within the same state. So for them, the idea of a nation or the idea of common collective identity can be with the entire country, can be with his language, can be with his caste, etc. That's a state nation. It accommodates these imagined communities to live together. What's a nation state? A nation state is where the state and nation boundaries align and coincide, right? There's many examples of nation states, or basically the idea of the nation, the idea of the common identity among people, or do coincide with the state. For example, France is an example of this. As you guys have learned about nationalism in France, the idea of nationalism amongst the French people aligned with the boundaries of the France territory, right? So hopefully you guys understood these confusing terminology and how they're not all the same and how we should use them appropriately. Contents of this chapter. So as mentioned in the textbook, there are 9 contents or 9 subheadings in this chapter. Number 1, what is a state? This is based on the definition from the Black's Law Dictionary. Number 2, concept of state and Article 12. Number 3, what is government? Number 4, emergence of state from society. Number 5, definition of state from Garner's definition. Number 6, theories on the origin of state. 7, elements of state. 8, role of state. And 9, exercises. What is a state? This is a definition from Black's Law Dictionary, which is also given in our textbook. And while this may seem intimidating and you might believe that you have to memorize this, it's not actually needed. I will give you guys the explanation of this definition, and I'll also be telling you guys a trick to learn this definition, which will be emphasizing on the keywords and how we can use these keywords to frame the entire definition without having to memorize it, and we'll just get a in-depth explanation of all the words in the definition, right? So firstly, the explanation. This is the definition of the state from Black's Law Dictionary. I've kind of zoomed it up, and I'll be going through each keyword and I'll be explaining what that means to give you guys an entire explanation of this definition and how it captures the definition of a state. Firstly, the state is the political system. What is political system? It's a set of rules that make up the government, right? Of a body of people. So we have the people or a population. A political system, a body of people who are politically organized. Politically organized means the people have organized themselves into parties, associations, etc. And they are ready to, contest elections and make up the government and exercise supreme power over themselves. The system of rules by which jurisdiction is the area or territory over which one has authority or supreme power. Another word for authority and supreme power is sovereignty, right? So basically, you can say the jurisdiction is an area or territory over which one has sovereignty. So the system of rules, which means the government, has jurisdiction and sovereignty, which is exercised over the body of people. Okay, so these are all the keywords, and if you want to remember this definition, just remember, as I mentioned, state has four elements: government, population, territory, sovereignty. And this definition clearly makes use of all these four elements to define a state. So that proves that this is the correct definition of a state, and it's also a way for you guys to remember it. So if you just remember that the state has four elements, we know that this definition is made up of these four elements, but not in the exact verbatim. For example, instead of saying government, they use political system, system of rules. Instead of saying population, they use body of people and politically organized. Instead of saying territory, they mention jurisdiction, which jurisdiction obviously means the territory, right? Hopefully this was understood. Now let's move on to concept of state and Article 12 of the Indian Constitution. So in part 3 of the Constitution, which is from Article 12 to 35, Article 14 to 35 are the fundamental rights. Then you might be wondering, what does Article 12 and 13 say if they're part of part 3, but they're not a fundamental right? Well, Article 12 essentially defines the term state in the Indian Constitution unless it's mentioned otherwise. Right? So in the Indian Constitution, unless it mentions that the word state is used for the actual Indian states, the term state defines something else. It defines India, the entire government and all the institutions of India as a whole. Let me show you. According to Article 12, state is made up of four things in India, right? In India, state defines the executive legislature of the union government, the executive and legislature of the state government, the local authorities in India or panchayats, and the local authorities controlled by Government of India, that is union territories. Right? So anytime in the Constitution, if the word state is used, if it doesn't mention otherwise, then we have to assume that state refers to all these four things of India: the union government, state government, local authorities controlled by Government of India, and the local government or panchayats. Right? So let me show you guys the application of Article 12. So here we have Article 13, which states that the state shall not make any law which takes away or abridges the rights conferred by this part, which basically means the state shall not make any law which takes away fundamental rights. Here, what does state refer to? It refers to these four things that is defined in Article 12. That's it. And even in the fundamental rights, it mentions the word state. For example, Article 15 says, the state shall allow no discrimination on the basis of gender, religion, caste, etc. State refers to these things. These four elements, the union government, state government, executive, legislature, they shall not allow discrimination on the basis of the social conditions. So, two questions may arise after looking at Article 12. Number one, is Article 12 fundamental right? No, it's not a fundamental right technically. It defines state, which is entailed in the fundamental rights from Article 14 to 35. The second question that may arise to you is judiciary a state under Article 12? As we mentioned, state, the definition of state in Article 12 only talks about the executive and legislature of the union government, executive legislature of state government, etc. But judiciary, which as we know consists of Supreme Court, High Courts, lower courts, it's not mentioned as a state under Article 12, but judiciary cannot make laws which violate fundamental rights, as mentioned in Article 13. What is government? So, as you can see, this is the third heading, third topic in this chapter, and even for the definition of state is from Black's Law Dictionary. Black's Law Dictionary defines government as the structure of principles and rules determining how a state or organization is regulated. So we know what government, it is defined in Black's Law Dictionary as the structure of principles and rules determining how the state is regulated. So for any organization or a state, it needs to be regulated to maintain the social political order, to maintain law and peace and security. And for that, we need a structure of principles and rules. For example, we know that the government has three organs: legislature, executive, and judiciary. The legislature makes laws, the executive enforces laws, and the judiciary interprets laws. And all these things are revolved around the structure of principles and rules. And these three organs of government, they determine how the state is regulated by making laws which help the people, which enforces the laws, interprets the laws in case it's unconstitutional. So now let's talk about the differences between state and government. So in the textbook, they have given us this table. However, this table is misleading because it doesn't give us the basis of comparison with each point. So I'm just going to simplify this and add the basis. So the differences between state and government. On the basis of elements, state has four elements: territory, population, government, and sovereignty. And government, it is only one of the elements of state. So that's the difference. That's one of the differences between state and government. Second, on the basis of sovereignty, sovereignty is a hallmark or the feature of a state, and sovereignty belongs to the state. Government doesn't have complete sovereignty. It exercises the supreme power, which is entailed in sovereignty, on behalf of the state, or on behalf of the welfare of people. The government can exercise sovereign power. On the basis of territory, the state has sovereign ownership over territory, as state is a territorial entity, whereas government preserves, protects, or defends state territory. Doesn't have sovereign ownership over it, as the state has it, whereas government is just an element of the state.